Have you ever looked back at one single night and realized it quietly changed everything that came after? Not because of what happened in the moment, but because of the truth that finally came to light. Some memories fade with time. Others stay buried for years, waiting for the right moment to return. Today's true guilty pleasure story begins with an ordinary camping trip that was supposed to bring a group of friends closer together. Instead, it uncovered emotions, secrets, and one confession that nobody saw coming. It all started on a cool autumn evening when Amelia agreed to spend the weekend in the mountains with a few close friends. Life had been overwhelming for everyone, and the trip was meant to be a simple escape from work, family responsibilities, and the constant noise of everyday life. There was laughter around the campfire, stories shared under a sky full of stars, and the kind of peaceful silence that only nature can create. At first, nothing felt unusual. But sometimes the calmest nights hide the biggest surprises. Amelia wasn't acting like herself. She smiled when everyone else laughed, but there was a distance in her eyes that only a careful observer could notice. Every now and then, she would stare into the fire as if she were replaying a memory she couldn't forget. Nobody wanted to ask questions. Everyone assumed she was simply tired. As the evening grew darker, the group settled into their tents. The wind picked up outside, the trees whispered in the darkness, and the peaceful camping adventure slowly turned into something none of them expected. It wasn't danger that changed everything. It wasn't a dramatic accident or a mysterious stranger appearing in the woods. It was a conversation. A quiet, deeply personal conversation that began with a simple question and ended with a confession powerful enough to reshape friendships forever. Amelia finally admitted that she had been carrying a secret for years. It wasn't something illegal or shocking in the way people often imagine. It was something emotional, something that had quietly influenced every major decision she had made. The people listening didn't know whether to comfort her, question her, or simply remain silent. Sometimes the hardest truths aren't loud. They're whispered. If you've ever wondered how one honest moment can completely change relationships, this true emotional story will keep you thinking long after it's over. It's a story about trust, guilt, hidden feelings, and the unexpected weight of keeping a secret. As the night continued inside that small tent, every word Amelia spoke seemed to make the silence outside even louder. What happened next would force everyone to question what they thought they knew about loyalty, friendship, and the choices people make when they're afraid of disappointing those they love. And just when it seemed Amelia was finally ready to reveal the one detail that explained everything, someone outside the tent stepped closer, paused at the entrance, and heard the first sentence of the confession that was never meant for anyone else. Nobody inside the tent moved. The footsteps outside stopped just a few feet away, and for a few long seconds, the only sound anyone could hear was the wind brushing against the fabric. Amelia lowered her voice, almost as if she already knew someone might be listening. She glanced at the others with a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Before I say anything else," she whispered, "you have to promise you'll hear the whole story." No one answered immediately. They simply nodded. The mood had changed so quickly that it was hard to believe this was the same group that had been laughing around the campfire less than an hour earlier. Ethan, who had organized the camping trip, leaned back against his sleeping bag and folded his arms. He had known Amelia for years, yet he had never seen her this unsettled. She wasn't someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. If she had decided to speak now, there had to be a reason. Amelia took a slow breath before continuing. She explained that the secret wasn't about something that had happened that day. It had started months earlier, with a decision she thought would never affect anyone else. At the time, keeping quiet had seemed like the easiest choice. She believed the truth would disappear if she ignored it long enough. Instead, the weight of that decision followed her everywhere, quietly changing how she saw the people she cared about. Outside, the footsteps finally moved away, but nobody inside the tent noticed. Every person was focused on Amelia's words. They weren't hearing a dramatic confession filled with anger or blame. They were listening to someone who sounded tired from carrying the same burden for far too long. That honesty made the moment feel even heavier. "I kept telling myself tomorrow would be the right time," Amelia admitted. "Then tomorrow became next week, and eventually, I stopped believing there would ever be a right time." Her friends exchanged uncertain glances. They could sense she was getting closer to the part she had been afraid to share. Questions filled the silence, but nobody interrupted. They knew that if they rushed her, she might stop talking altogether. The campfire outside had nearly burned out, leaving only a soft orange glow filtering through the trees. The peaceful mountain night suddenly felt different, as though the forest itself were waiting for the rest of Amelia's story. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and slowly pulled out a small folded envelope that looked worn from being opened and closed countless times. "I've carried this with me ever since it happened," she said quietly. "I thought I'd never let anyone see it." The others stared at the envelope without saying a word. Whatever was inside had clearly been important enough for Amelia to protect all this time. Then, just as she began unfolding the paper, a voice from outside the tent calmly called her name. Amelia froze. The folded envelope slipped slightly in her hand as everyone inside the tent looked toward the entrance. The voice outside wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, familiar, and almost hesitant, which somehow made the moment even more unsettling. Ethan slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Standing beside the fading campfire was Noah, another member of the group who had stepped away earlier, saying he wanted to take a short walk before going to sleep. "I wasn't trying to listen," Noah said quietly. "I heard my name, and then I heard Amelia's voice." His expression wasn't one of suspicion. It was concern. That only made Amelia more uncomfortable. She lowered her eyes, unsure whether to invite him in or ask for a few more minutes. Finally, she nodded. Noah stepped inside, careful not to disturb the silence that had settled over everyone. No one spoke for several seconds. The atmosphere had become heavier than before, as if every person in the tent understood they were standing at the edge of a truth that could change the way they looked at one another. Amelia held the envelope tightly. "This isn't about blaming anyone," she said. "It's about a choice I made because I thought I was protecting everyone." She paused, searching for the right words. But sometimes keeping a secret doesn't protect people. Sometimes it only creates distance. Her friends listened without interrupting. Each of them quietly replayed the past several months in their minds, wondering if they had missed signs they should have noticed. Small moments that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt meaningful. Amelia looked from one familiar face to another before taking a slow breath. "If I show you what's inside this envelope," she whispered, "you'll finally understand why I've been carrying so much guilt." With careful hands, she unfolded the paper at last. Before anyone could read the first line, a single unexpected sentence made every face in the tent turn pale. The mystery had only grown deeper. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The words on the page were simple, yet they carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire tent. Amelia carefully folded the letter halfway again, as if she suddenly regretted letting anyone see it. Her hands trembled, not from the cold mountain air but from the fear of what would happen once the whole truth came out. Ethan looked at her with quiet concern. "You've been carrying this alone all this time?" he asked softly. Amelia nodded. "Every single day." Noah leaned forward, trying to understand. The letter wasn't accusing anyone. It wasn't filled with anger or threats. Instead, it hinted at a decision made long ago, one that had connected everyone in the tent in ways they had never realized. The realization left each of them wondering whether their memories of the past were missing an important piece. Outside, the wind grew stronger, making the tent fabric ripple with every gust. The fading campfire cast moving shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty inside. No one reached for their phone. No one suggested ending the conversation. They all sensed they had reached a point where turning back was no longer possible. Amelia closed her eyes for a second before speaking again. "The letter explains how everything began," she said. "But it doesn't explain why I stayed silent." That answer mattered even more. Questions rushed through everyone's minds. Had someone asked Amelia to keep the secret? Had she misunderstood what really happened? Or had fear convinced her that telling the truth would only make things worse? She took one more deep breath and unfolded the final section of the letter. "There's one part I've never read out loud," she whispered. Just as she prepared to read the last paragraph, a sudden knock against the outside of the tent broke the silence. Every conversation stopped. The group exchanged uneasy glances, realizing someone else had arrived at exactly the wrong moment, and whoever it was had likely heard far more than they were ever supposed to. No one inside the tent dared to move. The knock came again, this time a little firmer, followed by a familiar voice asking if everyone was still awake. It was Grace, one of the last people anyone expected to see standing outside. She had gone to bed early, saying she was exhausted from the long hike. Ethan slowly opened the tent, trying to act as though nothing unusual had happened. Grace looked around at the tense faces and immediately sensed the mood. "Did I interrupt something?" she asked quietly. Before anyone could answer, her eyes landed on the folded letter in Amelia's hands. The color drained from her face. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for Noah to notice. "You've seen that letter before," Noah said. Grace didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped inside and sat near the entrance, staring at the ground. The silence that followed was heavier than any words could have been. Amelia looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "I never thought you'd recognize it," Amelia whispered. Grace finally looked up. "I recognized the envelope before I recognized the handwriting." The room seemed to shrink around them. Ethan exchanged confused glances with the others. Until that moment, everyone believed Amelia had carried this secret alone. Now it appeared someone else had been connected to it from the very beginning. Grace folded her hands together. "There are parts of this story you don't know," she said carefully. "And there are parts that even Amelia doesn't know." Those words changed everything. Amelia stared at her in silence. For months, maybe even years, she had believed she understood exactly what had happened. Now doubt crept into her mind. Had she built her guilt around an incomplete story? The wind outside grew louder, rattling the branches above the campsite. Inside the tent, every face reflected the same question: what had really happened? Grace reached into her backpack and pulled out a small notebook with worn edges. She held it for a moment before placing it beside Amelia's letter. "I promised someone I would never open this again," Grace said softly. "But after hearing part of your confession, I don't think keeping that promise is helping anyone anymore." Amelia looked from the notebook to the letter in her hands. Two pieces of the same mystery now rested between them. One held the story she had believed for years. The other threatened to rewrite everything. As Grace slowly untied the faded ribbon around the notebook, Amelia whispered, almost to herself, "If what's inside changes the truth, then I've been blaming myself for the wrong reason all along." Grace opened the notebook with slow, careful hands. The pages were filled with dated entries, small observations, and conversations written down over many months. It wasn't a diary of dramatic events. It was a record of misunderstandings, quiet worries, and moments that had seemed too important to forget. As she turned to one marked page, she looked at Amelia and gently said, "You never knew the whole story because I thought keeping this hidden would spare everyone more pain." The group leaned closer as Grace began to read. Months earlier, Amelia had discovered the letter and assumed it was connected to a decision that had hurt someone close to the group. Feeling responsible, she carried the burden in silence, convinced that speaking up would only reopen old wounds. But the notebook revealed something different. The letter had been written during a time when emotions were running high, yet it was never meant to place blame on anyone. It was an unfinished message, drafted in confusion and never delivered as its writer had intended. Amelia's eyes filled with tears, not because she had been accused, but because she realized how many years she had spent blaming herself for something she never truly understood. "I built my whole story around one piece of paper," she said quietly. "I never stopped to ask if there was another side." Ethan let out a slow breath. "We all do that sometimes," he replied. "We fill in the blanks with our fears." One by one, the group began sharing memories they had kept to themselves. Small misunderstandings that had quietly changed friendships suddenly made sense. Conversations they thought had been forgotten took on new meaning. The tension that had filled the tent slowly gave way to honesty. No one was perfect, but everyone finally understood that silence had created far more distance than the truth ever could. Amelia carefully folded the letter and placed it beside Grace's notebook. For the first time in years, she felt lighter. The guilt she had carried no longer belonged to her alone, it had been replaced by understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to face the past together. Just as everyone believed the mystery had finally been solved, Noah noticed one last folded page tucked into the back cover of the notebook. It hadn't been read. Grace frowned. "I've never seen that page before." With curious eyes, Amelia unfolded it. The handwriting matched the original letter, but the final sentence stopped everyone cold. It read, "If you're reading this, then someone finally uncovered only half of what really happened. The rest of the truth was left somewhere no one has thought to look." The campfire outside had burned down to glowing embers, but inside the tent, the story was far from over. Everyone silently realized that while Amelia's confession had found its ending, the greatest mystery had only just begun. For a few moments, nobody reached for the final page again. The silence inside the tent felt different now. It was no longer filled with fear, but with curiosity. Ethan finally smiled and broke the tension. "Maybe we've spent too many years searching for one perfect answer," he said. "Maybe what mattered most was finally talking to each other." Grace nodded. "That page doesn't erase what we learned tonight. It reminds us that every story has more than one perspective." Amelia looked down at the letter one last time before carefully placing it back into the envelope. She realized the paper had never been the real weight she was carrying. The real burden had been the assumptions she had made and the silence she had chosen. By finally speaking honestly with the people she trusted, she had already found the answer she needed most. The next morning, the group woke before sunrise. The mountains looked completely different in the early light. The same trails, trees, and quiet campsite that had felt mysterious the night before now seemed peaceful again. They packed their camping gear slowly, talking more openly than they had in years. Small conversations replaced awkward silence, and laughter returned naturally. Before leaving, Amelia walked back to the spot where the campfire had burned through the night. She held the envelope in her hands for a moment, then slipped it safely into her backpack. She didn't need to destroy it or hide it anymore. It had become a reminder that the truth is rarely as simple as it first appears. Noah looked toward the forest trail and smiled. "So, are we ever going to find out what that last message meant?" Grace laughed softly. "Maybe someday. But not today." Everyone agreed. Some mysteries deserved patience instead of rushed conclusions. If the remaining truth was important, they would discover it when the time was right and together. As they hiked back down the mountain, Amelia felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: peace. Her confession had not ended friendships as she feared. Instead, it had strengthened them. The guilt she had carried for so long had been replaced by trust, understanding, and a new beginning. Looking back, that wild night in the tent wasn't remembered because of fear or secrets. It was remembered because it reminded everyone that honest conversations can heal years of misunderstanding. Sometimes the hardest step is simply telling the truth, and sometimes the greatest guilty pleasure is finally letting go of unnecessary guilt. If this true guilty pleasure story teaches anything, it's that assumptions can create walls, but honesty builds bridges. Every friendship, every family, and every relationship becomes stronger when people choose open hearts over silent fears. And although not every question in life receives a perfect answer, finding the courage to speak the truth is often the ending that matters most.